Renters faced with eviction have some new help from the city and Greater Boston Legal Services. They're offering a free smartphone and computer app known as Massachusetts Defense for Eviction, or MAID. The app makes it easier for tenants to keep track of deadlines for court cases. There's also help with meeting requirements for paperwork and storing documents. The app's available in multiple languages. For more information, you can go to the website for Greater Boston Legal Services, www.gbls.org. Drivers are getting a heads up on how to avoid delays from construction projects at Logan Airport. The projects include expansion of the international terminal, improved access roads to other terminals, and new parking. According to the Boston Globe, Massport's trying to reduce car trips by lowering fares for express buses from Logan to Back Bay Station. In the months ahead, Massport will use a marketing campaign to let drivers know about detours and progress on construction. Banks and credit unions are trying to close the opportunity gap for doing business in recreational marijuana. According to the Globe, companies might have a chance to get financing from the GFA Federal Credit Union. The businesses have also been dealing with two banks headquartered in Massachusetts. Because marijuana remains illegal under federal law, it's more difficult to get financing from mainstream lenders. That creates an advantage for companies with large reserves of cash. A second contractor doing work in the North End has been cited by the city for safety violations. According to the Globe, Moriarty and Associates has since been allowed to continue some of its work on the Boston Garden office tower. The company was cited last week after material fell from the work site on Causeway Street. Another contractor was cited after falling material from a building at Commercial Wharf left a woman passing by critically injured. Still to come, how more parking gets you less housing and higher prices. We'll hear about a new report from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Population and job growth in Massachusetts requires more housing along with affordability. But the housing market also runs on off-street parking, as in the more you have, the more it's worth. And that makes housing more scarce and more costly. In response, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did some poking around and found that housing scarcity might also be driven by a parking glut. To tell us about the findings are the Council's Data Service Director, Tim Reardon, and the Transportation Policy and Planning Specialist, Kasia Hart. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with Tim. Before you go out and poke around, I guess you must have known that there's something going on out there that you want to look at more closely. So what was that exactly?
Well, anybody who pays any attention to planning and development in Massachusetts knows that there's something going on with parking. It is probably the most common topic of conversation when there's a zoning discussion, a development review, anything going on in a community. People bring up parking. Often, people are concerned there might not be enough. More recently, we see people saying, hey, maybe we should have a little bit less. Meanwhile, developers they've got to weigh the market and figure out how much do I put here, how much is going to satisfy the neighbors, how much do I need to sell my units. So there's a lot of different interests. And the challenge is that all those conversations are happening in the absence of any real data about how much parking is being used and how much parking is needed.
Kasia, in a market-driven economy, why would people pay too much money for parking? I mean, what makes that happen?
It's expensive to build. It costs a lot of money to construct even just a surface parking space. We found that on average, based on the data that we collected, parking costs about $16,000 a space, which drives up development costs, in turn drives up housing costs, which plays, a real critical threat to our affordable housing crisis.
Tim, before you come up with numbers, you have to make sure you're counting correctly. So you have to do this at a certain time of day. I imagine when people are more likely to have a car parked in the driveway. So how did this get planned?
Yeah. Well, Kasia was interfacing with the developers.
So we wanted to make sure when we were doing these overnight counts, we were going out when we assumed parking is as full as it's going to get. Most residents are home for the evening. So we went out and we did the counts overnight on a weeknight, not during a holiday week or a school vacation week. And we found that 3 out of 10 spaces were empty during peak demand times, which is quite significant.
Tim, what about the areas that you had to include? Because this is not just distant suburbs here.
No, we looked at 14 different cities and towns all around Boston, as far north as Melrose, as far south as Quincy, and out to Newton and Waltham. So we have areas that are right in downtown Boston at North Station. We have places that are out in more suburban areas, some that are right next to transit, some that might have bus service. So a wide variety of areas. And across every city and town we studied, there was more parking provided than was needed, often by a factor of, as Kasia said, 30% more than was being used. So it's a very wide variety of areas that we studied.
Kasia, it's easy to understand too much parking means less housing. So why do developers put in too much parking? I mean, what's driving that?
They don't often want to. Part of it is parking requirements that have been set for decades. And we do see cities and towns sort of chipping away at the edges around parking reform, reducing requirements. But oftentimes parking requirements are still much higher than that's actually demanded. And oftentimes there's also concern from neighbors that there won't be a space for them, or people may be parking on street. So it's a combination of different factors.
Some developers also see it as a marketable amenity, especially with condos. If you want to sell a condo, a lot of those owners are going to be looking to get a space with it. Yeah. Even for luxury rental apartments, a lot of renters are going to be looking to get a space with it. And so the developers say, well, if I provide a space with this, then a car-owning household who's likely to earn more is going to be more likely to rent my apartment. So I can rent the apartment for a higher rent because it comes along with a space. That means the cost of the apartment goes up. And often, unfortunately, folks who don't own a car are forced to pay for that space if they live in that apartment. That's one of the recommendations that we had in the report, is to unbundle parking so that people can choose to rent an apartment without having to rent the parking that goes along with it.
Kasia, there were also some locations in the city where you found some excess parking. I live near one of these locations.
Oh, yeah.
I'm on Mission Hill, and there's a development called Serenity, a high-rise apartment building. I don't remember my neighbors or even myself saying, gee, they need more parking over there. I mean, how did that happen?
It's, like I said, a combination of different factors. So the development proposal comes in and they have the public meetings, and there are some concern perhaps from neighboring residents that want to see more parking, want to make sure there is no residents from other buildings or parking on street. There's also a dearth of data available in these conversations about how much parking is needed at multifamily developments, which is part of the reason we wanted to do this work and introduce more data into these conversations.
Yeah, and I'll just add, on-street parking, competition for on-street parking spaces is the biggest thing that drives that from in a public policy or development review point of view is the biggest thing that drives that. Neighbors come out and they say, well, I'm worried that if you don't build enough parking here, people in this apartment are going to be parking on the street, and I'm already parking on the street, and I don't want anybody competing for my space. And the reason for that is that we're basically giving away on-street parking spaces for free. And so naturally, if you provide a limited supply of something and don't charge for it, there's going to be tremendous competition for that. And so the reaction in the policy world we have right now is to say, okay, well, let's oversubscribe parking for new residential developments to minimize any competition for those on-street spaces.
This is being in the news. We're talking with Tim Reardon and Kasia Hart from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Kasia, I know you mentioned the need to get hands-on data, but what about the expectations for what people need? Are those changing, maybe?
Absolutely. With the introduction of new transportation technologies such as Uber and Lyft, the proliferation of bike share services and micromobility services, I think we are increasingly becoming less car dependent. And there's also an increased desire for homes near transit stations. And I'm sure Tim can point to some specific data points that speaks to this, but I think we are seeing a lot in terms of changing demand for vehicle ownership and less reliance on owning a personal vehicle.
Tim, when I think of suburban sprawl, I picture families where even teenagers need cars to get around and go to school. But is this a reflection of needs, or are these parking spaces maybe an incentive for people to do something different too?
It's a little bit of both. One thing we found was that that need is part of it. Those residential developments that were in places where they had good transit access to jobs and services and things like that, those places had lower parking demand. So people who live right next to a commuter rail station or right next to a rapid transit station, now MBTA issues notwithstanding, those folks had less demand for parking. But also, one of the most significant things we found was that supply is the biggest predictor of parking demand. The more spaces that are provided, the more spaces are used per unit. And that's because, people say, oh, well, there's a space. I mean, I've heard people who move to the region and they say, well, I was going to get rid of my car when I moved to downtown Boston, but there was a free parking space that came with my unit, so I figured I'd keep my car. Well, it's that sort of, by making it so easy to park, that encourages people to own a car, and when people have an easy place to pull in and pull out, they're more likely to use it for short trips that maybe they could take by transit, walking, biking, one of these new micromobility options.
Do either of you think this could also mean fewer people using the T for a daily basis, like going to work, and maybe causing more congestion? What do you think, Kasia?
I think it's entirely possible, especially if you have people who are on the cusp of making that decision. Do I keep my car or not? Well, it's easy, convenient. I'm not paying any extra to park my vehicle. I think those people may, be finding themselves in the decision more often to drive versus take the T when it is another readily available option.
Yeah.
Tim, what about environmental impact? You see anything that you're concerned about from this?
Well, certainly, if folks find it more convenient to own and use a vehicle when they could have cleaner and more sustainable options, that's going to lead to greater gas usage and greenhouse gas emissions. More importantly, it means that people who when the additional cost of parking then means that lower income folks or car-free people can't find a unit that they can afford near transit, maybe then it pushes them further out of the city where they're then required to get a car. And now instead of having one car-free household living right on top of transit and the household that wants and needs to own a car living further away, you have two households, both of whom own a car and both of whom are therefore likely to drive it. Now, we're not arguing, this is not a report that proposes abolishing the car or abolishing private parking. What it's about is trying to create a better balance and to recognize that the provision of parking can really incentivize people to own a car when otherwise they wouldn't need to, and in doing so cause a lot of impacts for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Kasia, I'm familiar with developers coming into Boston doing traffic studies. They have experts absorbing data and processing it. How would you get new data into play here for this?
I think this data set is exactly the kind of new information that we want to be introducing into these conversations. This is about as local as it gets. We have a lot of the parking industry standards that are referenced often, but those don't often distinguish between, suburban, urban, transit accessible versus not. How does affordability come into play? So I think this kind of more nuanced data set is really important to introduce into the conversation.
And I think we could take a cue from some other cities as well that are looking at development impacts in a more nuanced way. The city of San Francisco, for example, instead of using a one-size-fits-all, they incorporate things like how many parking spaces do you have? Do you provide T-passes? Do you provide bike parking? What's the size of the units? A lot of different things that they're using to support transit demand management.
And finally, Kasia, you've got a website. People can see this all in full, so where should they go?
perfectfitparking.mapc.org.
Right, thank you both very much, Kasia Hart and Tim Reardon from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.